Hello and welcome back to Philosophy of Religion, and the topic for this week is the nature and attributes of God. Of course, God is the central feature of many of the world religions, including the three so-called Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. God isn't a feature of all religions, though. There's no God in Buddhism, or in some versions of Hinduism, or in many of the New Age faiths that sprung up in the 20th century. And in this unit, we will touch upon Buddhism and Hinduism near the end, but they're not the main focus of this unit. So, on to our topic. No matter whether one is a theist, an atheist, or agnostic, it's important to understand what is meant by God. Obviously, if one is a theist, one will want to know what exactly it is that one believes in. But the need for a clear notion of God is not just restricted to theists. For as one philosopher wrote, even an atheist or agnostic needs a notion of God to deny or doubt. In other words, an atheist will need to know what exactly it is that he or she is denying the existence of. It makes little sense to say that one denies the existence of something unless one knows what that something is or is supposed to be. What then should we understand by God? Well, before we attempt an answer to this question, it's worth noting that many different things have been described as God. In fact, we're sometimes led to believe that there has been a clear development in what human beings have recognized as God or as a God. It is said that some of our earliest ancestors worshipped trees or volcanoes or spirits of mountains, which presumably served as their gods. So here gods would be very much manifested in the world. Indeed, they're part of the world. And the ancient Greeks recognized a clutch of figures as gods. Think of Zeus and Aphrodite and Apollo. These gods were thought of as being quite human-like in some ways. In fact, they often behaved like unruly humans. But in other ways, they weren't human-like. These gods were supposed to be immortal, and many of them were thought to live on Mount Olympus. So here, the gods are quite literally up there. In other words, they're above us. And then in place of a multitude of gods, religions like Judaism and Christianity recognized only the one God. Early on in both religions, God was thought to be a powerful being dwelling in the sky, but this gradually yielded to the view that we're now familiar with today, in which God is thought not to have a spatial location at all. Nowadays, Jews and Christians tend to think of God as a spiritual being, separate from the earth, and indeed from the whole physical universe. So here, God is thought to be out there. Now, if we follow this story, then we can see a transformation in the way humans have thought of God or gods. First of all, there's a clear shift from many gods, which is polytheism, to one God, which is monotheism. Secondly, there's a clear shift from immanent gods, that is, a being or beings that are very much part of the fabric of the world, to a being or beings above the world. And then finally, to a transcendent God. In other words, a being that's completely separate from the world. So if we follow that story through, we start with immanent gods, gods that are very much part of the world. Then we come to gods that are above the world, and then finally to a transcendent God, completely separate from the world. Now, unfortunately, like many stories in philosophy, this one is almost certainly too simple or simplistic to be true. And at best, it may describe what happened in Europe. Outside of Europe, the picture is very different. There are some societies, such as China, which do not appear to have acknowledged a god at all. at least until it was imported from elsewhere. And as for Africa, the lack of written records for much of its history makes it impossible to tell if there has been a transformation in the way God has been conceived there. And if there has, whether it in any way mirrors the transformation seen in European societies. In fact, some people have argued that African societies have only ever been monotheistic. So I think at the very least, we cannot simply assume that changes in the way that Europeans have conceived of God have been mirrored elsewhere. In any case, it should be clear that God has been conceived in different ways by different peoples at different times. The fact that different societies and cultures have recognized different things as God or as gods has the potential to make it difficult to pin down exactly what is meant by the term God. Yet, of course, when today's philosophers talk about God, they are unlikely to be referring to spirits or the gods of ancient Greece or a being in the sky. Instead, they are likely to be referring to the supreme being that stands at the center of the three Abrahamic faiths, at least insofar as these faiths have been understood philosophically. And this being is typically described as having the following attributes: omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness, which is sometimes called omnibenevolence, which just literally means all good willing. Now, the concept of God as an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good being is the classical or traditional understanding of God, at least in the West. And many theists in the West also recognize other attributes of God. For example, God is supposed to be free, has free will. God is omnipresent, so is everywhere. God is necessary, in other words, cannot not exist. God is supposed to be simple, so not composite. And God is supposed to be timeless, in the sense of being outside of time. Now, some theists don't recognize all of these attributes as being true attributes of God. There are some theists who recognize more attributes than those, so lots of differences of views. But for our purposes, it's enough to say that the traditional concept of God involves, at a minimum, the attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness. And typically, or very often, incorporates some or all of the other attributes that are listed there. But there looks to be a bit of a problem here. The God described in the sacred texts of the Abrahamic faiths is, in the words of one writer, personal, historically active, slow to anger, and plentiful in anger. However, the God that philosophers of religion tend to discuss is depicted not like this, but rather as the possessor of a very specific set of attributes, namely omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness, and so on. So, whereas the sacred texts of the Abrahamic religions describe God in very personal terms, philosophers have tended to opt for a different and rather more impersonal description. And the two descriptions can sometimes clash. For example, the philosopher's notion of a timeless God seems to conflict with claims found in the Hebrew Bible that God sometimes has a change of mind. And this has led some to wonder whether believers understand one thing by God and philosophers something else. And indeed, the notion of God that philosophers tend to work with is in some ways very different from the notion of God found in the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic sacred writings, where God is often described as mighty or almighty rather than omnipotent, which is a term that you won't find in the sacred texts at all. Likewise, you won't find terms like omniscience or perfect goodness in the sacred texts either. In fact, the notion of God as omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, and perhaps even omnipresent and necessary and so on, that's often referred to as the God of the philosophers. And the reason for describing it in that way is to draw a distinction between God as understood by philosophers and God as understood by believers. So what should we make of this? Well, one line of thinking is that we are here working with two entirely different conceptions of God. One of them found in the sacred texts, the other devised by philosophers. Another line of thinking is that what might seem on the surface to be different conceptions of God are in fact one and the same. It could be argued, for example, that the reasons for the divergent descriptions owes much to the fact that believers and philosophers tend to flesh out their understanding of God in different ways. Believers attempt to gain knowledge of God a posteriori. In other words, they read sacred texts which describe the individual they know as God, or they consult those who claim to have had experiences of this individual, and so on. Philosophers, on the other hand, attempt to gain knowledge of God a priori. In other words, by starting with a minimal definition of God, such as a supreme being, and then they will try to derive more information about God from that. So philosophers are more concerned with the concept of God than they are with the person of God, whereas the opposite tends to be the case with believers. But perhaps this is not surprising, because the believer and the philosopher have different aims, don't they? The believer wants to worship, and the philosopher wants to study. So, with all this in mind, we turn now to the topic of God's nature. As we have seen, the traditional or classical concept of God is that of a being who possesses attributes like omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness. And it's an interesting question whether the sacred texts of the Abrahamic religions really do depict God as possessing such attributes, or whether such a conception is more a product of philosophical speculation and imagination. But let's put this question to one side and focus on the attribute of omnipotence to see what sense can be made of that. Obviously, if it were to turn out that the concept of omnipotence is incoherent, then it would not be an attribute that any being could have. On the other hand, if it turns out to be coherent, then a being could potentially be omnipotent. Though, of course, whether there is an omnipotent being, or whether the Abrahamic religions are committed to the existence of an omnipotent being, well, that's another question altogether. Okay, so omnipotence then. Omnipotence has traditionally been thought to mean the ability or the power to do all things. But what exactly does that mean? One possibility is to take the term at face value, and therefore suppose that God can quite literally do absolutely anything at all. And this is sometimes referred to as absolute omnipotence. And here, absolute presumably just means unqualified by anything. So there would be nothing whatsoever that impinges on God's power. So an absolutely omnipotent God would be able to do things like change the truths of mathematics and logic. And together they're often called the eternal truths. And they're thought not to be able to change. But an absolutely omnipotent God surely would be able to change them. So an absolutely omnipotent God could decree that the sum 2 plus 2 equals 5 rather than 4. An absolutely omnipotent God could also repeal the logical law of identity, which says X is X. And, that God could just replace that with something else, like X equals Y. It seems very few people have actually held that God is omnipotent in this absolute sense. René Descartes is one who did. He believed that the truths of mathematics and logic had been chosen by God, and that God could have chosen other truths in their place if so desired. So Descartes tells us, and this is the quotation in red on the PowerPoint, "The mathematical truths which you call eternal have been laid down by God and depend on him entirely, no less than the rest of his creatures." Indeed, to say that these truths are independent of God is to talk of him as if he were Jupiter or Saturn, and to subject him to the Styx and the Fates. Please do not hesitate to assert and proclaim everywhere that it is God who has laid down these laws in nature, just as a king lays down laws in his kingdom. So that's Descartes there. Now, Descartes wasn't the only philosopher to adopt this view of God's omnipotence, though literature on the topic might lead you to think that he was, because he's often the only one mentioned. But another person who endorsed this idea of absolute omnipotence was a chap called Pierre Perrault. Perrault claimed that it's absurd to suppose that God could simply discover eternal truths in his understanding without having any right over them. So the problem for both Descartes and Perrault lies in the consideration that unless God had created these truths, they would be independent of him. In other words, these truths wouldn't be under his control. In other words, God would be subject to these truths. They would constrain or restrict him in his operation. And both of them were concerned that this threatened God's sufficiency and perfection. So clearly there are good theological reasons for wanting to grant that God has got the power to do absolutely everything, even to the point of being able to decide the content of eternal truths or even to change them. But even though there might be a good theological reason for believing this, the idea has still struck most philosophers as highly problematic. The chief concern is that granting God absolute omnipotence would give him the power to do the impossible, which is simply incoherent because it amounts to saying that it is possible for God to do the impossible. Consequently, the thinking goes, it must be the case that power extends only to the performance of possible actions. Those actions that are not possible are simply not genuine actions, and so not within the power of any being, even an omnipotent one. And for this reason, philosophers and theologians have tended to shy away from the thought that God is absolutely omnipotent. And as a result, a popular suggestion among theists has been this. They say, perhaps omnipotence is the power to do whatever is logically possible, or the ability to bring about any logically possible state of affairs. Now, something is logically possible if it doesn't lead to a contradiction. So a square is something that's logically possible because there's no contradiction in the idea of a square, which is just a four-sided figure. But a square triangle is not something that is logically possible. In fact, it's logically impossible because there is a contradiction in the idea of a shape that's both four-sided and three-sided at the same time. Other examples of logical impossibility would be a married bachelor. In other words, an unmarried man who is married, right? That's considered to be logically impossible. Changing the past would be considered to be logically impossible because that's making what has happened not happened. So those are examples of things that are thought to be logically impossible. So if omnipotence is the power to do whatever is logically possible, then it won't be possible for God to make a square triangle, or a married bachelor, or to change the past, all of which are supposed to be logically impossible. So this conception of omnipotence as the power to do whatever is logically possible, it has proved very popular among theists. So I've given a couple of examples on the screen there. One is from 1824 and the other's from 2010. So a big distance in time separates them, but they're both quite happy with the idea that omnipotence involves the power to do whatever's logically possible. In spite of the different locutions, both statements actually say the same thing, that omnipotence is the power to do whatever is logically possible. So here's our second way then of understanding omnipotence, one which has enjoyed great, widespread and sustained popularity among philosophers of religion. But of course things are never that clear-cut, are they? And it has been noted that there is a problem with supposing that God has omnipotence in this sense, because it's thought that there are plenty of logically possible actions that we tend to think that God cannot perform. For example, breaking a promise. Can God break a promise? Well, the act of breaking a promise is certainly a logically possible one, because human beings demonstrate that every time they do it. But is it one that God can perform? And many theists want to answer no to this question. In other words, many theists want to say that God cannot break a promise. Likewise, many theists want to say that God cannot lie, and more broadly, that God cannot sin. Breaking a promise, lying, and sinning are thought to be ruled out by God's perfect goodness. In other words, it's not in God's character to break a promise, to lie, or to sin. And then there are puzzle cases as well, like the so-called paradox of the stone. And these seem to identify other actions that an omnipotent being cannot perform. The paradox of the stone asks whether an omnipotent God is able to create a stone so heavy that he cannot subsequently lift it. If we answer no, then we have found an action that God cannot perform, namely, creating a stone so heavy that he cannot subsequently lift it. But if we answer yes, we seem to have identified a different action that God cannot perform, namely lifting a stone that he has created. Likewise, it has been thought to be beyond God's power to create another omnipotent being. And this is because the notion of there being two omnipotent beings is incoherent. Just suppose there were two omnipotent beings, A and B. Let's call them A and B. Now, if omnipotent being A wants to create a universe and omnipotent being B doesn't, which one of them is going to prevail? If A prevails, then presumably B couldn't have been omnipotent. And if B prevails, then A presumably couldn't have been omnipotent. So it looks as if there can be at most one omnipotent being. Now, if there cannot be two or more omnipotent beings, this must mean that an omnipotent God cannot create one, because such an act would result in there being two omnipotent beings. So there are various things that an omnipotent God is generally thought to be unable to do, and we can summarize and categorize them as I have done in this table here. So the first column, well, that identifies those actions that are impossible for any being. The second column identifies those actions that look to be impossible for an omnipotent being, which is what God is traditionally thought to be, at least in classical theism. And the third column identifies those actions that look to be impossible for a being with a perfectly good character, which is traditionally thought to be another of God's attributes, at least again in classical theism. Now, as I've already mentioned, most theists don't think that God's inability to perform actions in the first column stems from any lack of power. And that's because the actions in that first column just don't describe genuine tasks. They just don't describe tasks that are genuinely possible to perform. But theists have been concerned about God's inability to perform actions listed in the second and third columns there. And in recent decades, this has led to some dissatisfaction with the notion of omnipotence as the power to do whatever is logically possible. As a result of this dissatisfaction, some philosophers have attempted different formulations of omnipotence, while others have tried to conceive God's power without using the concept of omnipotence at all. So what we're going to do now is briefly consider one such attempt to conceive of God's power without actually invoking the idea of omnipotence. So we're going to go back to a famous paper from 1973 by a philosopher called Peter Geach, and the paper's just called Omnipotence. In that paper, Geach suggested a different way of understanding God's power. In this paper, Geach draws a distinction between being omnipotent and being almighty. So, to be omnipotent is to have the power, is to have the ability to do everything. And to be almighty is to have power over all things. Okay, so the distinction is drawn there by Geach. Now, Geach finds the notion of omnipotence to be just completely beset with problems, largely for reasons that we've already considered. And in addition, he notes that the term omnipotence is not to be found in sacred texts like the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or the Quran. But his preferred term of almighty, well, it is used in all of those texts to describe God's power. So that gives the notion of an almighty God a lot more theological currency than the notion of an omnipotent God. And Geach explains that God's power over all things means that God is not only the most powerful being there is, but also the source of all power. Now, I think if you go and read the paper, a question to ask yourself is whether this helps us. Okay, if God has power over all things, does that mean that God has power over logical truths and mathematical truths? Well, presumably not. But in that case, what exactly does God have power over? And what doesn't God have power over? I think that's a crucially important thing to be thinking about with this notion. Now, however sympathetic one is to Geach's suggestion, it might be thought that attempts to reformulate the notion of omnipotence are simply not necessary, and that it is in fact adequately characterized as the power to do whatever is logically possible. So consider, for example, the third column in our table above. That just listed actions that many theists thought that it wasn't possible for God to perform, like break promises, lie, and sin. So we just ought to look at those in a little bit more detail now. So why do theists want to say that God cannot break a promise or lie or sin? Well, because such actions are incompatible with the attribute of perfect goodness, which is, of course, part of God's own nature. Consequently, to suppose that God could break a promise or lie or sin is to suppose that he could act contrary to his own nature. And ultimately, the worry here concerns God's essence, isn't it? God is essentially perfectly good. That's the thinking. He is essentially perfectly good. And that means he cannot not be perfectly good. But if God were to break a promise or lie or sin, then he wouldn't be perfectly good. So consequently, the argument goes, he cannot have the power to do these things. So that's what motivates theists to say what they do on this issue. But perhaps, and this is just a suggestion being floated now, perhaps theists shouldn't be so quick to say that God cannot break a promise or lie or sin. Perhaps it would be more correct to say that he can do these things, but that he won't. It has been argued that we need to say precisely this if we're to think of God as being good at all. So to explain what I mean by this, let's suppose that God cannot, and I mean literally cannot, it's not within his power to sin. Let's suppose that. Would it make sense to call such a being good? After all, in order to be good, one must choose to perform good actions. And if one genuinely chooses to perform good actions, then that presupposes that one has the power to perform good actions and bad actions, because it's this that enables choice. And this is why we wouldn't praise a robot designed and programmed to perform only good actions, because such a robot couldn't be said to choose to perform good actions, because it's only capable of performing the good ones. Whereas, of course, with humans, we routinely praise them when they perform good actions, because we recognize that they have a genuine choice open to them. They can perform good actions or bad ones. And we praise them because, while they have that choice, they've actually chosen to perform good actions. So it looks as if a good character presupposes the power to perform good and bad actions. So if we now return to the case of God, we might want to say this. If God is thought to be good, then presumably he must be choosing good over evil. And if he is making such a choice, then he must have the power to sin, because this is what makes possible a choice between good and evil. And if we do say this, then it follows that God must have the power to sin and to break a promise and lie, assuming that they're any different from sinning. So we're saying then that God must have the power to do this, but just chooses not to exercise that power. In other words, perhaps we're going to say then that God can sin, God has the power to sin, but on account of his goodness, he won't ever choose to do so. So it's a suggestion I'm just making there as to how the notion of omnipotence as that ability or the power to do whatever is logically possible might be salvaged against some of these problem cases connected with breaking a promise, lying, and sinning. If we accept the argument I've put forward there, then we'll wish to include breaking promises, lying, and sinning in the range of things that do, in fact, fall under God's power. And that would actually take us much closer back to the traditional idea of omnipotence as the power to do whatever is logically possible. We saw earlier that although breaking promises and lying and sinning are logically possible actions, many theists thought that they're not possible for God. But what I've tried to do is suggest that there's a reason for thinking that such actions are possible for God. And if they are, perhaps omnipotence can be characterized as the power to do whatever is logically possible. So it helps to clear up one of the problems that we've encountered when we've examined the notion of omnipotence. But of course, even if we accept the suggestion made there, well, that doesn't clear up all of the problems with omnipotence. Because, well, it still leaves us with the paradox of the stone.